A Fish Out of Water by Lawrence Unders. Phi. I came into the world imbued with the will to find a meaning in things, my spirit filled with the desire to attain to the source of the world. And then I found that I was an object in the midst of other objects. Frantz Fanon, Algerian psychiatrist and revolutionary, 1952. Prologue. Athens, 23/15/10/01. What are you afraid of? The thought was barely conscious. Not that it had become second nature. Not that he'd tuned it out, learned to ignore it. Nor was it a rhetorical question, not really a question at all. It was a mode of thinking, of being, and he had no intention of answering it, because it had no intention behind it. It was an intrusive, anxious thought. The pet felt it, more than thought it. What are you afraid of? But if it did become full-blown anxious thought, if he could answer that question, and if he were to be objective about it, say, able to detach his mind from his body, look at himself and his situation from a bird's point of view, then, in that moment, there would be too much to say. For starters, there's the general fear around him. The Marines in the barracks, for instance. They were all afraid, even as they pretended, like all do, until they don't, that everything was normal, that there was nothing to be afraid of. He knew it to be true. He was practically able to smell their fear. He did have a sensitive beak, after all. Their skin suits and uniforms were drenched in anxious sweat. It never washed out completely, only mixed together, homogenized. But he also felt it, in the way they treated him, variously showing superficial acts of kindness or kicking him around. He felt it. Then again, they treated him like any other pet, which he supposed was normal. If he could tell them to stop, tell them how much their kicking hurt him, he knew they would deny it, say it was for his own good, then use what he said against him. He wasn't sure which he would prefer anyway, the real kicking or the fake kindness. They had every reason to be afraid. He knew that, for the Marines were never the same. Every month, a whole platoon would be switched out, and newcomers took their place. Then they would remain strangers, since, 6 months later, they would never see these people again. And the Marines all knew that, so why bother making friends? Buddies, perhaps? Someone to pass the time with? To talk to while on patrol? To play games with during free time? But never friends. Having no one to rely on, no stable relationship with a person, causes fear in human beings, who had evolved to be social and communal, to feel at home in each other's company. That's what he had in common with them, no one. Not that he really thought on that level, even as he felt it to be true. For this bird-like humanoid, sensing was knowing, and he sensed that, for humans, the opposite is true. He knew a lot about humans, not just because he served them. It was something he picked up over time. After learning what evolution is, then seeing the parallels between human evolution and human development, and then noticing what bound them together, history, both social and ecological. Thus he had a moving picture in his mind, of hominids branching off from each other due to social things they evolved, such as language and concepts and tools, in response to their environments and each other. This picture melded into another and another. Of these branching hominids becoming Homo sapiens, of these Homo sapiens developing society and culture out of ecology and linguistics, of society and culture growing, branching off, growing more, branching off more, some branches dying, starving to death or killing each other, ever growing. Then there were branches subsuming other branches, converging, solidifying, eradicating each other, which happened both within groups and between them. All these groups gradually got bigger and bigger. Band, tribe, clan, kingdom, larger kingdom, empire, world governance, which parallel changes in environment, primordial nature, farming and trading villages, towns set away from farms and nature, bigger towns sent farther away, cities set away from or consuming towns and farmland and nature, bigger cities consuming more, megacities finally dividing humans and nature completely, consuming the whole world, which paralleled growing divisions of labor between old and young, men and women, hunter and gatherer, warrior and farmer, producers and distributors, chiefs and people, masters and slave, lords and serfs, benefactors and takers, civils and pubs, humans and hypers. Somewhat in that order, though with more overlap than not. Then, finally, the picture melded into individual humans in these environments, going about their lives with their individual differences, each being subject to the cumulative development that came before, each being part of the cumulative development that would come to be. It all happened over the course of thousands of years, so gradually that most humans think that the world they are thrown into is the world as it should be, the world as God intended it, or as necessitated by nature. And it was all mashed together, mixed and chaotic, less like overlapping layers and more like springs that flow into streams, then brooks, then creeks, then rivers, coming together, pooling into ponds and lakes, then finally washing into and mixing with the ocean. Or really like a tree, which is how natural history and family history alike are represented. And, like anything on which humans put their categorical concepts of order, the underlying chaos meant that most people looked at the same evolution, history, developments, world, and saw only what fit their particular ideas of order. Among humans, there's no such thing as observe first, analyze later. That's why so many think primarily in words. In any case, whatever picture best showed his thoughts on the matter, human history had clearly stagnated, even as it had made its greatest leap. That didn't mean it stopped. A stagnant body of water, after all, may just take time to fill and overflow. But there's simply no denying that they had reached a bottleneck, a dam as it were, that would first fill with foul, toxic runoff before bursting. Or maybe it had burst, who knows? Then he was born, and so there was the specific fear that pertained to only his kind, the pets. The kindness and kicking, for sure, was cause for fear. But that was only the tip of the iceberg. All his life, fear is all he knew, because that was the reason for his birth in the first place. Or, at least, that was one way to look at it. The training he went through, the conditioning, which all pets must do, started at an early age. It started before he could even properly remember, and his memory was quite good. He was trained, as his parents were, and his parents' parents, and all his siblings and cousins and, now, nibblings, to fear. That training was plain and simple. Do something wrong, something bad happened to him. Don't do something well enough, something bad happened to him. Something bad happens to a human, something bad happens to him. Nothing in particular happens at all, something bad happens to him. Has nothing bad happened in a while? The training really was to learn how to serve the humans. But this continual, malicious correction at their hands trained him as well. It trained him to read them, trained him to recognize when he should stay or go, trained him to hear more in their words and see more in their deeds than they ever did. He was very sensitive to their feelings, in part because that was how he survived, and in part because he still had empathy, compassion for them. For he had another thing in common with them. It was the thing in his head, which he didn't have the words to name, not even in his thoughts. That thing was what made them, he and the humans he served part of the same class, even as he was the slave and they were the masters. It was that thing, after all, that was the source of most of his fears. All at once, he would be compelled to do something he didn't want to do. Like clockwork, the thing would compel him to get out of bed, gather the things that had been left around, the skin suits and weapons, or, years ago, when he was still the stakeholder's pet, the clothes and toys of the children. Then it would compel him to go about his day, cleaning for the sake of cleaning, cooking for the sake of cooking, doing a whole bunch of chores that machines could have done instead, that they did anyway, but that he also had to do for the sake of doing something. When he was still in training, it compelled him to do exercises, to learn techniques, to learn what humans need in order to feel cared for, children and adults alike. Likewise, the Marines were compelled to train for the sake of training, go on patrol for the sake of going on patrol, report for the sake of reporting. But it was different for them. The thing didn't bite them unless they told it to. Each Marine controlled the thing in their head. Each Marine could configure the thing to discipline them in the way they wanted, so much so that the military rarely had to override them. So much so that the Marines chose to carry them all their lives, whereas the thing in all pets' heads was configured by their COs, their masters. Then there was the universal fear. That is, this universe is something truly to be afraid of, even if it is also, sometimes, a wonder to be alive in. He didn't have much understanding of the universe, only what he could discover by accident, by stumbling upon manuals open in holotop terminals, by listening to the vids that the Marines or the children watched, and by talking to his family. That's how he discovered and learned about things like evolution and history and development. The pets carried a wealth of knowledge about humans and the universe, knowledge that the humans never knew. Not that he could talk in the way a human can. The thing in his head allowed no more than a few simple words and phrases. But they communicated, found a way to use language by other means. In the times when they weren't compelled by the things in their heads, he and his family would make objects that carry meaning, their parts symbolizing words, their whole conveying concepts. Pass the objects around, put them together, and they could say a lot to each other, all without the humans ever knowing. For the humans regarded the objects as toys made for them, or else as contraptions they could use. And there was some truth in that, for if he and the other pets made them just for themselves, the humans would never allow it, and the things in their heads would compel them to stop. Which got to the particular fear, the fear of here and now, of that very moment. He had found something that he knew he shouldn't have. It was something that one of the Marines had dropped, that he knew he should give back to them. But the thing, a device, round like a ball, was something he could also communicate with. He knew if he took it apart, changed it a little bit here, a little bit there, then he could say things he would never have been able to say before. He could finally talk to his family again, finally go see them. Yet he also knew, if he was caught with it, his correction would be worse than it had ever been before. So he had kept it with him for several months, hid it from the Marines, hid it even from the other pets in the barracks. After all, he didn't want them to be corrected for something he did. All this time he had been working on it in secret, at night, when he could see but the humans couldn't, or else out of sight altogether, relying on his other senses to make the changes he somehow just knew needed to be made. He could rely on senses that the humans didn't even have. But, clearly, he hadn't been careful enough. For now a human had come asking for the thing, asking in the worst way imaginable, asking kindly.